Picture this. It's December 25th, 1776, and you're a Hessian soldier in Trenton, New Jersey. You've spent Christmas Eve drinking rum and singing songs with your comrades, celebrating another easy victory in this pathetic colonial rebellion. Your officers told you the war is basically over. The Continental Army is a broken, starving mob scattered across Pennsylvania, too weak and too frightened to fight. You're warm, well-fed, and you've just gone to bed thinking about the fat bonus waiting for you when you get back to Germany. Then, at 8 o'clock in the morning, through the howling wind and sleet, you hear something that shouldn't be possible. Musket fire, cannon fire, and screaming in English. You stumble out of your quarters, half-dressed, trying to understand what's happening. Through the storm, you see them. Ghosts in ragged clothes, barefoot men leaving bloody footprints in the snow, soldiers who should be dead, marching straight at you with fixed bayonets and eyes that burn with something far more dangerous than anger. They burn with desperation. This is the moment when George Washington, who has lost nearly every battle he's fought this year, who commands an army that's deserting by the hundreds every week, stakes everything on one impossible gamble. He's going to cross an ice-choked river in the middle of a blizzard, march 9 miles through a winter storm, and attack a fortified garrison of professional soldiers who have never lost a battle. It's suicide. It's madness. And it's about to become the most important victory in American history. Because if Washington fails here, if his frozen, starving men break and run one more time, the American Revolution dies in the snow at Trenton. But if he wins, if this broken army can prove they can still fight, then everything changes. Before diving into the story of desperation and redemption, if you enjoy learning about the moments when history balanced on a knife's edge, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these pivotal American moments together from different parts of the country and the world, connected across time by our shared appreciation for the courage that built this nation. Now, let's understand why Washington was desperate enough to attempt the impossible. To understand why Trenton mattered so much, you have to understand just how catastrophically bad 1776 had been for George Washington and the Continental Army. This wasn't a string of close defeats or honorable retreats. This was a complete meltdown of American military power. The year had started with such promise. In March, Washington had finally forced the British out of Boston after the siege. It looked like the rebellion might actually work. Congress was buzzing with optimism. Recruiters signed up thousands of new soldiers. The Declaration of Independence was signed in July with genuine hope that this new nation might survive. Then reality hit like a sledgehammer. The British came back with the largest expeditionary force ever sent across the Atlantic Ocean. 32,000 professional soldiers, 10,000 German mercenaries, the famous Hessians, 400 transport ships, 73 warships. And commanding this massive force was General William Howe, a competent, cautious professional who had one simple job: crush this rebellion before winter. Washington had about 19,000 men on paper, but most of them were militia, farmers who'd signed up for a few months, never fired a gun in anger, and really just wanted to go home. They weren't cowards. They were just normal people who had been told this would be a short fight. Nobody had prepared them for what was coming. The Battle of Long Island in August was the disaster that set the tone for everything that followed. Washington tried to defend New York City. It was a strategic nightmare from the start. The city was on an island. The British controlled the sea. Washington's army could be surrounded and trapped at any moment. And that's exactly what happened. On August 27th, General Howe landed 20,000 men on Long Island and proceeded to teach Washington a brutal lesson in professional warfare. The British executed a perfect flanking maneuver. While a small force demonstrated in front of the American lines, keeping them pinned in place, the main British force marched through an unguarded pass and slammed into the American left flank at dawn. The Continental soldiers, most of whom had never seen combat, broke and ran. It wasn't even close. The fighting was vicious and one-sided. The Maryland Regiment, 400 men, sacrificed themselves in a desperate delaying action just to give the rest of the army time to retreat. They charged the British lines 6 times. Only 12 men survived. Washington watched from a hill as his army disintegrated. Witnesses said he kept repeating, "Good God, what brave fellows I must this day lose." He lost more than brave fellows. He lost 1,200 men captured, 300 killed, and worst of all, he lost the illusion that courage and patriotism could substitute for training and experience. The Continental Army retreated across the East River to Manhattan in a desperate overnight evacuation. It should have been the end. Howe could have trapped them, could have ended the war right there. But he hesitated, and Washington escaped with the broken remnants of his force. That escape just delayed the inevitable. The British pursued Washington across Manhattan, pushed him off the island, chased him through Westchester County, and kept hammering his shrinking army. Every time Washington tried to make a stand, the British outmaneuvered him. Every time he tried to retreat, he lost more men to desertion. By late November, Washington had been driven completely out of New York and across New Jersey. His army was dissolving. Men were deserting in groups of 50 and 100 at a time. They weren't running to the enemy, they were just going home. They were cold, hungry, sick, and they hadn't been paid in months. The enlistments for most of the army were set to expire on December 31st. In 5 weeks, Washington would have almost no army at all. The Continental Congress, watching this catastrophe unfold, panicked and fled from Philadelphia to Baltimore. They gave Washington dictatorial powers, basically admitting they had no idea how to fix this mess. British General Howe was so confident the rebellion was finished that he stopped pursuing Washington and went into winter quarters. He scattered his forces across New Jersey in comfortable towns, left garrisons of Hessian and British troops to hold the territory, and went back to New York to enjoy the winter in warmth and luxury. He treated the war as over. The Hessians, professional German soldiers, rented out to the British by their princes, were assigned to hold the forward positions. They were good soldiers, well-trained, well-equipped, and experienced. But they were also mercenaries fighting for money in a war they didn't understand, occupying towns full of people who hated them. By mid-December, Washington had retreated all the way across New Jersey and crossed the Delaware River into Pennsylvania. He'd seized every boat for miles up and down the river so the British couldn't follow. His army, which had started the campaign with 19,000 men, was down to about 6,000 effective soldiers. They were camped in the freezing mud. They had no winter uniforms. Many had no shoes. Some wrapped their feet in rags. The phrase, "bloody footprints in the snow," isn't poetic exaggeration. It's what actually happened when these men marched. Thomas Paine, the writer and propagandist, was with the army during this retreat. He sat by a campfire in December and wrote the opening lines of The American Crisis. These are the times that try men's souls. The summer soldier and the sunshine patriot will, in this crisis, shrink from the service of their country, but he that stands by it now deserves the love and thanks of man and woman. Paine understood what Washington was facing. The summer soldiers were gone. The sunshine patriots had deserted. What was left was the hardcore, the men who hadn't quit, even though they had every reason to. But even these men needed something to fight for. They needed a victory. They needed to remember what winning felt like. Washington looked at his broken army and at the calendar and realized he had one last chance, one last throw of the dice before the enlistments expired and the army vanished completely. He started planning the impossible. The situation facing Washington in mid-December was mathematically insane. He had about 6,000 men fit for duty. Across the river in New Jersey, the British and Hessians had scattered about 8,000 troops in various garrisons. On paper, that looks almost even, but paper doesn't account for reality. The Hessians were professional soldiers. Washington's men were exhausted, underfed, and demoralized. The Hessians had artillery, ammunition, and supplies. Washington's army was running out of everything. The Hessians were warm and rested. Washington's men were freezing. Conventional military wisdom said, you don't attack in winter. You don't cross a major river to attack a fortified position. You don't split your forces into multiple columns in the dark. And you absolutely don't do all of this with an army that's falling apart. Washington decided to do all of it anyway. His target was Trenton, a small town on the Delaware River about 9 miles from where his army was camped. Trenton was garrisoned by about 1,500 Hessian soldiers under the command of Colonel Johann Rall. Rall was a brave, aggressive officer with a great combat record. He'd fought well at White Plains and Fort Washington, but he had two fatal flaws. First, he was arrogant. He didn't respect the Continental Army. He'd beaten them repeatedly and considered them a rabble of cowards who ran at the first sight of Hessian bayonets. Second, he was lazy about defensive preparations. His men had built almost no fortifications around Trenton. When his officers suggested building redoubts and entrenchments, Rall dismissed the idea. He reportedly said, "Let them come. We'll go at them with the bayonet." It was exactly the attitude Washington was counting on. But planning the attack and executing it were two completely different things. Washington's plan was brilliant and insane in equal measure. He would divide his forces into three groups. The main force, 2,400 men under Washington's personal command, would cross the Delaware at McConkey's Ferry, 9 miles north of Trenton. They would march south through the night and hit Trenton from two directions at dawn. A second force, under Colonel Cadwalader, would cross south of Trenton and create a diversion. A third force under General Ewing would cross directly across from Trenton and block the southern escape route. If everything worked perfectly, the Hessians would be trapped and overwhelmed. But this plan required everything to work perfectly. The three columns would have to cross the river independently, march through a winter storm in the dark, arrive at exactly the right time, and attack simultaneously without any way to communicate with each other. The chances of pulling this off were somewhere between slim and none. Washington knew it. His officers knew it. But they also knew that doing nothing meant watching the army dissolve and the revolution die. So they prepared to roll the dice. The crossing was scheduled for Christmas night. Washington chose this date deliberately. Christmas was a major holiday for the German soldiers. They would be celebrating, drinking, relaxing. Their guard would be down. It was the best chance Washington would get. He didn't tell his men where they were going. He just told them to be ready to march with 3 days' rations and 40 rounds of ammunition. Most of them didn't have 40 rounds. Many didn't have 3 days' rations. They had what they had, and it would have to be enough. On Christmas Day, as the Hessians in Trenton were preparing their holiday celebrations, Washington's army started moving into position along the river. The weather was getting worse. A winter storm was building, bringing sleet, snow, and wind. For the crossing, this was actually good news. The worse the weather, the less likely the Hessians would expect an attack. But it also meant the crossing would be even more dangerous than planned. The Delaware River in winter is not a gentle stream. It's wide, fast, and full of ice flows. The boats Washington had seized were mostly Durham boats, big cargo vessels designed to haul iron ore. They were 40 to 60 feet long, flat-bottomed, and could carry a lot of men, but they weren't designed for a military assault crossing in a blizzard. As darkness fell on Christmas night, the operation began, and immediately things started going wrong. The crossing of the Delaware has been immortalized in that famous painting by Emanuel Leutze. You've seen it. Washington, standing heroically in the bow of a boat, crossing the river in daylight, with the American flag waving and ice chunks floating by. It's a beautiful image. It's also almost completely wrong. The real crossing was nothing like that painting. It was dark, freezing, and chaotic. There was no flag waving because you don't wave flags when you're trying to achieve surprise. Washington wasn't standing in the bow looking heroic. He was huddled in a boat, worrying about whether his insane plan was going to work. And the crossing didn't happen in daylight. It started at 6 o'clock in the evening on Christmas night and took 9 brutal hours to complete. The plan called for everyone to be across by midnight, giving the army time to march 9 miles and attack at dawn. That schedule fell apart immediately. The storm that Washington was counting on to provide cover turned out to be worse than anyone expected. The wind was howling. The sleet was coming down horizontally, stinging exposed skin like needles. The temperature was dropping towards 0, and the Delaware was choked with ice. Not solid ice, which you could walk on, but chunks of ice, some as big as small houses, grinding against each other in the current. The boats had to be muscled through this ice, by men using poles to push the ice away. It was exhausting, dangerous work. If a boat got caught between 2 big ice chunks, it could be crushed. If a man fell overboard, he'd be dead from the cold in minutes. The operation was run by Colonel John Glover and his Marblehead Regiment. These were sailors and fishermen from Massachusetts, men who knew boats and rivers. Without them, the crossing would have been impossible. They worked through the night, ferrying load after load of soldiers across the river. Each trip took time. Load the men, push off, fight through the ice, unload on the other side, row back. Do it again, and again, and again. For 9 hours. Washington crossed early and waited on the New Jersey side, watching his army trickle across, far more slowly than planned. By midnight, when the entire force was supposed to be across and marching, only about half the men had made it. The artillery was still on the Pennsylvania side. The horses were terrified and difficult to control. The schedule was blown. Washington faced a choice: call it off, or push forward, knowing they'd be attacking in daylight instead of at dawn. Attacking in daylight meant losing the element of surprise. It meant the Hessians would see them coming. It violated the entire premise of the plan. Any sane commander would have aborted the mission. Washington kept going. He knew this was his last chance. If he turned back now, he'd never get another opportunity. The army would dissolve. The revolution would collapse. He had to attack, even if the conditions were all wrong. At 3 o'clock in the morning, the last of the army finally made it across. They were already 3 hours behind schedule. Washington formed them up on the Jersey side and gave the order to march. 2,400 men, soaking wet, frozen to the bone, began marching south through the storm toward Trenton. The march was agony. The road was a ribbon of ice and mud. Men were slipping, falling, getting up, falling again. The sleet never stopped. It coated everything in ice. Muskets became encrusted. Gunpowder got wet. Soldiers had wrapped their musket locks in rags to try to keep them dry. But it was a losing battle. Some men's feet were wrapped in bloody rags. With each step, they left red stains in the snow. But they didn't stop. They didn't quit. They kept moving. Washington rode up and down the column, checking on his men. At one point, he passed a group of soldiers and heard one of them say, "I can't feel my feet." Washington called out, "Then keep moving, or you never will again." It wasn't comforting, but it was true. Stopping meant freezing to death. Movement was survival. As they marched, Washington got word that the other two prongs of the attack, Cadwalader's and Ewing's forces, had failed to cross the river. The ice had stopped them. Washington's column was on its own. There would be no diversion, no blocking force. The entire operation now rested on the 2,400 men slogging through the storm. At Birmingham, about 4 miles north of Trenton, Washington split his force into 2 columns. One, under General Nathaniel Greene, would approach Trenton from the north. The other, under General John Sullivan, would swing east and approach from the west. The plan was for both columns to hit the town simultaneously from 2 directions, trapping the Hessians in a vise. The 2 forces split and disappeared into the storm. They were now marching independently, with no way to communicate. If one column got lost or delayed, the other would attack alone, and probably be destroyed. Everything depended on timing and luck. As dawn approached, the storm began to ease slightly. The sleet turned to snow. Visibility improved just enough to make out the road. The men were moving like zombies, exhausted beyond measure, but still moving. They were close now, very close, and the Hessians in Trenton had no idea they were coming. Colonel Johann Rall was 50 years old, a career soldier who'd fought in the 7 Years' War and earned his rank through competence and courage. He was not a fool, but he'd made a series of small mistakes that were about to compound into a catastrophe. First, he dismissed the idea of building fortifications. Trenton had no earthworks, no redoubts, no defensive positions prepared. The town was just a collection of buildings along 2 main streets. Rall believed that Hessian discipline and bayonets were better than walls. Second, he'd ignored multiple warnings. Local loyalists had sent him messages saying that the rebels were planning something. Farmers had reported seeing movement across the river. A Tory farmer even rode into Trenton on Christmas night, trying to deliver a note warning of an attack. Rall was at a party, playing cards and drinking, and refused to be disturbed. The note was put in his pocket unread. He'd die with it still there. Third, and most fatally, Rahl had let his men celebrate Christmas. The Hessians had spent Christmas Day feasting and drinking. By nightfall, many were drunk. Some were passed out. The officers were at parties. The sentries were cold, miserable, and not particularly alert. They'd been stationed in Trenton for weeks. Nothing had happened. Why would tonight be different? There had been some harassment. American militia would occasionally take potshots at Hessian patrols. There'd been a minor skirmish a few days earlier, but nothing serious. Nothing that suggested the broken Continental Army was capable of mounting a real attack. So when the sentries heard something in the storm at 8 o'clock in the morning on December 26th, they assumed it was just more militia harassment. By the time they realized what was actually coming at them, it was too late. Washington's 2 columns had made it to the outskirts of Trenton at almost exactly the same time. It was a minor miracle of coordination. Greene's column was approaching from the north, Sullivan's from the west. Both were in position. At 8 o'clock, with the snow still falling, Washington gave the order to advance. The password was victory or death. The attack began not with a grand charge, but with a stumbling advance of frozen, exhausted men who could barely feel their fingers. But when the first shots rang out, something changed. The Continental soldiers, who'd been beaten and chased for months, who'd lost battle after battle, who'd been mocked and dismissed as cowards, suddenly remembered that they were fighting for something. They weren't fighting for a king or for money. They were fighting for their homes, their families, and their freedom. And the rage that had been building through all those defeats came roaring out. The Hessian sentries fired a few shots and ran back into town, shouting the alarm. "Der Feind! Der Feind! The enemy! The enemy!" Drums began beating. Officers stumbled out of houses, trying to organize their men, but the Americans were already on top of them. Continental artillery, under the command of a young captain named Alexander Hamilton, wheeled into position at the head of King Street and Queen Street, the 2 main roads through town. The guns opened fire, blasting canisters shot down the streets. Canister was essentially a tin can full of musket balls. When fired from a cannon, it turned the gun into a giant shotgun. At close range, it was devastating. The Hessians tried to form up in the streets to counterattack, but they couldn't. Every time they started to organize, American artillery ripped through them. Sullivan's column came in from the west, driving into the town with bayonets fixed. Greene's column poured in from the north. The Hessians were caught between 2 forces and couldn't establish a coherent defense. Rahl, to his credit, tried to rally his men. He mounted his horse and rode into the chaos, shouting orders, trying to form a battle line. He managed to get 2 regiments partially organized and led a counterattack up King Street, directly into the American guns. It was brave. It was also suicidal. The Continental artillery fired point blank into the Hessian formation. Men went down in clumps. The formation wavered, but kept coming. Rahl was in front, urging them on. Then he was hit. 2 musket balls struck him, one in the side, one in the hip. He fell from his horse, mortally wounded. With their commander down, the Hessian counterattack collapsed. Some units tried to retreat south out of town, but they ran into American infantry blocking the road. They were trapped. The battle lasted about an hour and a half. It wasn't close. The Hessians fought bravely, but they were outmaneuvered, outgunned, and surrounded. Small groups tried to make stands in houses and were blasted out by artillery. Others tried to surrender, but couldn't make themselves understood over the noise. Finally, white flags started appearing. Officers threw down their swords. Soldiers dropped their muskets. The battle was over. The butcher's bill was astonishing. The Americans had 4 wounded. 4. Not 400. 4 men. And most of those had been hurt during the march, not in the fighting. The Hessians had 22 killed, 83 wounded, and over 900 captured. Washington had just pulled off the most lopsided victory of the war. But he knew he wasn't done. He'd won the battle, but now he had to win the aftermath. The scene in Trenton after the battle was chaos. Nearly 1,000 Hessian prisoners milled around in the snow, shocked and humiliated. These were professional soldiers who'd fought across Europe. They'd never surrendered before. Now, they were captives of an army they'd been told was finished. The Continental soldiers were searching houses, collecting weapons, and trying to find food and supplies. They were also, in some cases, finding the rum that the Hessians had been drinking the night before. Washington had to move fast to prevent his victory from turning into a drunken disaster. He gave strict orders. No looting, no drinking. Treat the prisoners well. He needed discipline now more than ever. The Hessian officers were brought before Washington. He greeted them courteously, even kindly. He made sure the wounded, including Colonel Rahl, received medical attention. Rahl died of his wounds later that day, but not before expressing his surprise that the Americans had outmaneuvered him so completely. Washington's treatment of the prisoners was not just mercy, it was strategic. He wanted word to spread that the Continental Army fought honorably. He wanted Hessian soldiers across New Jersey to know that surrender was not a death sentence. It would pay dividends later, as more German units became reluctant to fight. But Washington had a bigger problem. He was deep in enemy territory, with an exhausted army, hundreds of prisoners, and limited ammunition. The British had garrisons at Princeton and New Brunswick, just a few miles away. When they learned what happened at Trenton, they'd send forces to trap him. He needed to get back across the Delaware before the British could react. He gave the order to move out. The army marched back toward the river, herding the prisoners along. They brought everything they could carry: Hessian muskets, ammunition, artillery pieces, supplies, flags. The march back was almost as hard as the march to Trenton had been. The men were beyond exhausted. They'd been awake for over 30 hours. They'd marched 18 miles through a blizzard. They'd fought a battle. Now they had to march back. Some men literally fell asleep while walking and had to be shaken awake. But they made it. By late afternoon, on December 26th, the entire force was back across the Delaware in Pennsylvania, safe, victorious, and holding nearly 1,000 prisoners. When news of the victory reached Philadelphia, the reaction was electric. Congress, which had fled the city in despair just weeks earlier, suddenly had hope again. The newspapers, which had been predicting the end of the revolution, now celebrated Washington as a military genius. Recruiting offices saw a surge of volunteers. Men who'd been thinking about deserting changed their minds. But the real impact was psychological. For 9 months, the Continental Army had been beaten, chased, and humiliated. Soldiers had started to believe they couldn't win, that the British and Hessians were simply better soldiers, that this rebellion was doomed. Trenton shattered that belief. Yes, the Americans had caught the Hessians by surprise. Yes, they'd had advantages. But they'd also executed a complex military operation that required courage, discipline, and skill. They'd crossed a river in a blizzard. They'd marched through hell. They'd coordinated a 2-pronged attack. And they'd won decisively. It proved something vital, that the Continental Army, properly led and properly motivated, could beat professional European soldiers. The propaganda value was enormous. American newspapers published exaggerated accounts of the battle. Artists created dramatic images. The phrase, "Washington crosses the Delaware," entered the national mythology. Even the British were impressed, though they tried to downplay it. General Howe, comfortable in New York, received the news with shock. He'd been so confident the war was over that he'd scattered his forces and gone into winter quarters. Now he had to reconsider everything. If Washington could pull off one surprise attack, he could pull off another. The British Army went on alert. Washington knew he'd bought time, but not much. The enlistments were still set to expire on December 31st. In 5 days, most of his army would legally be free to go home. He'd given them a victory, but would it be enough to make them stay? On December 30th, with just 1 day left before the enlistments expired, Washington gathered his army. He didn't make a flowery speech. He was direct. He told them that the victory at Trenton meant nothing if they all went home now. He told them that the British were gathering forces to crush them. He told them that the war and the revolution would be decided in the next few weeks. Then he made an offer. Stay for 6 more weeks. Just 6 weeks. And he'd pay them a $10 bonus out of his own pocket if Congress didn't come up with the money. It wasn't much. $10 was a pittance compared to what they'd sacrificed. But it was something. And more importantly, it was a personal appeal from Washington, who'd proven he was willing to risk his own life alongside them. The soldiers debated among themselves. Many wanted to go home. They'd done their duty. They'd enlisted, fought, nearly died. They'd missed Christmas with their families. They had farms to tend, families to feed. Going home was the rational choice. But standing there in the freezing camp, looking at the general who'd led them through hell and somehow found a way to win, many of them made the irrational choice. They stayed. Not all of them. Some went home. But enough stayed to keep an army in the field. It was enough for Washington to try one more throw of the dice. Because while Trenton had been a great victory, Washington knew it wasn't enough. He'd beaten one garrison by surprise. The British still controlled New Jersey. They still had overwhelming force. To really change the strategic situation, Washington needed to do something even more audacious. He needed to attack again. On December 30th, Washington made a decision that shocked his own officers. Instead of staying safely behind the Delaware River, he was going to cross back into New Jersey, reoccupy Trenton, and dare the British to come get him. It was insane. He'd be putting his army right back in the trap he'd just escaped. But Washington understood something his officers didn't. The initiative was everything. The British expected him to retreat and hide. By advancing, he'd throw them off balance. He'd force them to react to him instead of the other way around. On December 31st, the Continental Army crossed the Delaware again, reoccupied Trenton, and started digging defensive positions south of the town. They were setting up for the next act of this drama. The Battle of Trenton had been the first punch, but Washington wasn't done swinging. General Howe, receiving news that Washington had not only attacked Trenton but had now reoccupied it, decided this impudence had to be crushed immediately. He sent orders to Lord Cornwallis, one of his best generals, to march from New York with 8,000 men and destroy Washington's army once and for all. Cornwallis was not happy about this. He'd been packed and ready to sail back to England for the winter. He was literally about to board the ship when the orders arrived. But he was a professional, and he had his duty. He unpacked, assembled his forces, and marched toward Trenton. Cornwallis had 8,000 professional soldiers, artillery, and cavalry. Washington had about 5,000 men, many of them militia who'd just signed up. On paper, this should have been a straightforward British victory. Cornwallis thought so. He reportedly told his officers, "We'll bag the old fox in the morning." The old fox had other ideas. On January 2nd, Cornwallis's advance units made contact with American forces north of Trenton. There was skirmishing throughout the day as the Continental Army slowly fell back toward Trenton, contesting every mile. This was exactly what Washington wanted. He was buying time. By late afternoon, the British had pushed the Americans back into Trenton. Cornwallis's army was lined up north of the town. Washington's army was dug in south of the town, with their backs to the Delaware River. It looked like a trap. The Americans were pinned against the river with a superior British force in front of them. Cornwallis could see the American campfires across the Sunpink Creek. He could attack immediately and probably win. But it was getting dark. His men were tired from marching. And he'd learned from Trenton that Washington was tricky. Better to wait until morning, deploy properly, and crush the rebels in daylight. Cornwallis made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He told his officers, "We'll finish them in the morning." That night, Washington held a council of war. His situation looked hopeless. In front of him, a superior British force. Behind him, a river. If he tried to retreat across the river, the British would catch him in the middle of the crossing and slaughter him. If he stayed and fought, he'd be outnumbered and defeated. There was a third option, one so risky that several of his officers thought he'd lost his mind when he proposed it. Washington wanted to sneak his entire army out of the trap, march around Cornwallis's left flank, and attack the British supply base at Princeton, 12 miles away. This plan required several miracles to work. First, they'd have to slip away from Cornwallis without being detected. That meant keeping the campfires burning so the British thought the army was still there. It meant wrapping wagon wheels in rags to muffle the sound. It meant marching in complete silence past British positions that were less than a mile away. Second, they'd have to march 12 miles in the dark over frozen roads. Third, they'd have to attack Princeton, which was garrisoned by British regulars, and win quickly before Cornwallis realized what was happening and came back to trap them. The plan was so audacious that it just might work. At midnight on January 2nd, the Continental Army began to move. They left their campfires burning. They left a small group behind to make noise and keep the deception going. And they slipped away into the darkness. The march was brutal. The temperature had dropped below zero. The roads were sheets of ice. But the men moved in near-perfect silence. When a wagon wheel squeaked, soldiers would mob it to muffle the sound. No one spoke above a whisper. They marched east, then north, swinging wide around Cornwallis's position. It took all night. As dawn broke on January 3rd, the army was approaching Princeton from the east, the direction the British least expected an attack from. And Cornwallis, camped at Trenton, still thought Washington was trapped in front of him. The miracle had worked. Now Washington just had to win another battle against professional British soldiers. The Battle of Princeton was smaller than Trenton, but in some ways more impressive. The Americans ran into British forces marching from Princeton toward Trenton to reinforce Cornwallis. The two forces collided unexpectedly. The initial exchange went badly for the Americans. The British soldiers, professionals from the 17th and 55th Regiments, delivered disciplined volleys that tore through the American militia. The militia started to break and run. This was the critical moment. If the army broke here, the entire operation would collapse. Washington saw the crisis and did something that generals are not supposed to do. He personally led a cavalry charge to rally the troops. He rode directly between the American and British lines, within 30 yards of British muskets, trying to stop the retreat. His aides thought he was going to be killed. One officer covered his eyes, unable to watch his commander die. But Washington didn't die. He rallied the men, got them turned around, and led them forward in a counterattack. The fighting was close and vicious. For a few minutes, it could have gone either way. Then the rest of the Continental Army arrived and hit the British from multiple directions. The British line broke. They retreated toward Princeton with the Americans in pursuit. The battle moved into the town and onto the campus of the College of New Jersey, now Princeton University. There was fighting in and around Nassau Hall. The British tried to make a stand. American artillery fired on the building. One cannonball reportedly went through a window and decapitated a portrait of King George II. Eventually, the British surrendered. Washington had won again. 2 victories in 10 days. But he didn't have time to celebrate. Cornwallis, realizing he'd been tricked, was marching back from Trenton with his entire army. Washington was exhausted. His men were exhausted. They'd been marching and fighting for over 24 hours straight. A smart commander would have retreated to safety. Washington wanted to push his luck and attack the main British supply depot at New Brunswick. His officers talked him out of it. They were at the end of their endurance. Reluctantly, Washington agreed. The army marched north into the hills around Morristown and went into winter quarters. They'd done enough. The twin victories at Trenton and Princeton didn't win the war. The war would drag on for another 6 years. There would be more defeats, more suffering, and more desperate moments. But these 2 battles changed everything, in ways that went beyond the tactical situation. Strategically, Washington had cleared most of New Jersey of British forces. The British pulled back to New York and a few fortified positions. The grand plan to crush the rebellion quickly was abandoned. The war would now be a long, grinding conflict. Politically, the victories revived the revolutionary cause at exactly the moment it was about to collapse. Congress reconvened in Philadelphia. State governments that had been wavering renewed their commitment. Foreign observers, particularly the French, started to think that maybe the Americans could actually win this thing. Militarily, Washington had proven that the Continental Army could fight and win against professional European soldiers. Yes, he'd used surprise and cunning. But that was the point. He'd shown that Americans could win by fighting smart, not by copying European tactics. Psychologically, this was the most important impact. The soldiers who'd fought at Trenton and Princeton knew they could win. That knowledge sustained them through Valley Forge, through the long campaigns in the South, through all the hard years ahead. They'd faced the best soldiers the British Empire could send, and they'd beaten them. The Hessians never fully recovered their reputation. German princes had rented out their soldiers to the British for profit, telling them this would be an easy campaign. After Trenton, Hessian soldiers knew it was a lie. Many would desert. Some would settle in America after the war. The Battle of Trenton became mythological in American culture, almost immediately. Artists painted it. Writers described it. The image of Washington crossing the Delaware became an icon of American determination. The reality was even more impressive than the myth. Think about what Washington actually did. He took an army that had been beaten and chased for 6 months, an army that was literally days away from dissolving, an army that any rational observer would have written off as finished. He marched them through a blizzard. He crossed a river that should have been impassable. He attacked a fortified garrison on Christmas morning. He won decisively. Then, instead of retreating to safety, he crossed back, dared the British to attack him, slipped away from their trap, and won another battle. It was a masterpiece of audacity and operational art. Modern military historians study it as an example of how an inferior force can defeat a superior one through surprise, mobility, and superior intelligence. Washington knew where the Hessians were, what they were doing, how they thought. The British had no idea what Washington was planning until it was too late. But beyond the tactics and strategy, Trenton represents something deeper about the American military tradition. Washington's army didn't win because they were better trained or better equipped. They won because they wanted it more. They were fighting for their homes, their freedom, their future. The Hessians were fighting for money. The British soldiers were fighting because they'd been ordered to. That difference in motivation made all the difference. The citizen soldier, the amateur who rises to the occasion, the underdog who refuses to quit. This became the American archetype. It's not always true. Professional armies matter, training matters, equipment matters. But there's also something to be said for the volunteer who fights because he chooses to, not because he has to. Trenton also established Washington's reputation not just as a general, but as a leader. He'd risked everything on this operation. If it had failed, he would have been blamed for destroying the Continental Army and losing the war. But he'd seen what his officers couldn't see, that sometimes you have to risk everything to save anything. His men followed him into that frozen hell because they trusted him, and he justified that trust with victory. The story of Trenton reminds us that history is not inevitable. The American Revolution wasn't destined to succeed. On Christmas Day, 1776, it looked like it was destined to fail. The British were winning. The Continental Army was collapsing. The rebellion was dying. One man's decision to attack, one night's march through a blizzard, one morning's battle changed the course of history. If Washington had stayed on the Pennsylvania side of the Delaware, if he'd decided the risk was too great, if he'd been a more cautious commander, the United States of America might not exist. Britain might still control the eastern seaboard. The map of the world would look completely different. That's how thin the thread of history actually is. The men who left bloody footprints in the snow on the march to Trenton, the soldiers who crossed a frozen river because their general asked them to, the militia who stood their ground when professional soldiers shot at them. These were ordinary people who did extraordinary things at the exact moment history needed them to. They remind us that great nations aren't built by perfect people or ideal circumstances. They're built by flawed human beings who find the courage to act when everything is on the line. As you think about what it took to create this country, remember those frozen soldiers in December 1776. Remember that they had every reason to quit and go home. Remember that most people thought they were going to lose. Remember that they marched anyway, fought anyway, won anyway. That's the real miracle of Trenton. Not just that Washington crossed the Delaware, but that enough men believed in something bigger than themselves to make that crossing mean something. If you found this story of American perseverance and triumph compelling, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the battles and moments that defined our nation. And let me know in the comments, do you think Washington's gamble at Trenton was brilliant strategy or desperate luck? How do you think the war would have ended if Trenton had been a defeat? The conversation continues below. Until next time, remember that history isn't made by perfect plans executed in ideal conditions. It's made by determined people who refuse to accept defeat, even when every rational voice tells them the cause is lost. The frozen march to Trenton reminds us that the impossible becomes possible when ordinary people decide they're willing to risk everything for freedom.